the course of the last few weeks, we have been walking through a series that we call Slaying Giants. Now, slaying giants is really just a metaphor. Each of us, you have certain giant things in your life. These are the things that are the barriers or the walls that stand between where you are and where God wants you to be. So our goal throughout this series has been to tear down those walls, to break the chains of bondage over our lives, so that each and every one of us, every person that walks into this space, could be everything that God created you to be. So we've talked about things like hurt, and we've talked about things like your past, and we've talked about these things that kind of stand in the way. This week, we want to talk about giant loneliness. And before you say, well, that's not me, that's not something that I deal with, let me just tell you, none of us get to say that loneliness didn't touch us over the last 2 years, right? This has been the single most isolating time in the history of our country, in the history of our world. It has wrecked families and churches and communities. It has ravaged relationships. Let me just ask you a question, and I want you to be honest and vulnerable with me for a moment. Raise your hand if there is someone that pre-pandemic you felt like you could talk to, and now you feel like you can't. Raise your hand if there's somebody like that in your, right? It has hurt our relationships. And that's because we haven't had one pandemic, right? We haven't just had a health pandemic, we've had a political pandemic. We've had an economic pandemic. We've had a racial pandemic, right? And each one of these traumas in our culture drives another wedge between us and gives us another reason to divide with our brothers or sisters. But in the kingdom, in the ways of Jesus, where the slave and the master can sit at the same table, where there is no longer Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, this shouldn't be. These divisions shouldn't exist. And when you walk into this space, when you walk into that door, this door over here, and you walk in here and you sit down, you should be able to sit down knowing that I don't care what it is that someone else thinks near me, what the person next to me thinks in politics or any other thing, we are united around Jesus. And that unifies us. And in the face of all of the adversity and the division in our culture, which leads us to a very giant loneliness, the church should be the safe haven. This should be the place that bucks the trend, right? We should be countercultural in this way. So there has been a serious loneliness in our culture. The CDC most recently, they put out a lot of stats. We know that, right? Most recently, they've said that in last year, 61% of Americans said that they experienced serious loneliness, at least some or all the time. 61%. That means that if we reflected our culture, that means that 3 out of every 5 people in this room have been dealing with loneliness, not just occasionally, but in a real palpable way. The hardest hit people are the young adults and the moms with young children. 63% of young adults in the last year have dealt with depression. 58% says, nobody knows me well. I have no close friends. 21% say that they have no friends at all. And get this, people who have dealt over the last year that fall into those categories are 4 times more likely to have heart failure. And you ready for this? These are the people that are 18 to 40 years old. So loneliness, quite literally, can lead a person to their death. Isolation is an enemy of your heart. It's an enemy of your body, of your health, and of your soul. In 1960, from 1960 to 2022, our population, right, in the United States has grown by about 45%. However, single dwellings in the United States have grown from 6.5 million to 40 million in the United States, far outpacing the growth of our population. And yet, we have 4.62 billion active users on Facebook right now. So we are more connected online and more disconnected in real life than we've ever been. And this thing that we thought would be this solution that would bring us closer together has not. It's not done that. It's not working out. Depression rose 3 times during the pandemic. In the hardest hit areas, the suicide rate has had a 400% rise. So it's not just a health pandemic, right? It's so much more than that. Simple things like masks, and this is not an anti-mask statement, okay? But simple things like masks, which may be absolutely necessary to save a person's life in the short term, right? For young children, have created significant speech delays and social delays. There are children who are years behind on their speech development, right? And so it's you win one thing and you lose another, right? And so it's just craziness. It's hitting us all very, very hard. And so if that's you, if that's who you are, I just want you to know, in this space, you are not alone, right? But we got to ask that question, right? Have you ever felt alone? Has that ever been you? In the last 24 months, have you ever felt isolated, alone, like there was nobody to turn to? In your marriage, have you felt alone? Like you got 2 people in the same home, and yet you're closer physically than you could ever be, but emotionally and mentally and relationally, you couldn't feel further apart. The relationships with your friends, your coworkers, your boss, whoever you report to, have you ever felt alone? When you're sitting online and you're looking for connection and you're scrolling, artificially creating a sense of relational connection, have you ever stopped and just thought for a moment and felt as your heart sank and you realized that right now you're totally and completely alone? In your finances, you ever felt alone? You're experiencing a financial crisis or there's some big challenge in front of you, but you don't feel like you can share that with other people. And so you walk it alone. As you walk your neighborhood and you see other people that seem to have their life all together, right? And trust me, they don't. But you look at other people and you think they have something that I don't have. I'm alone. I'm missing something. I'm missing a certain level of connection and human community, and yet I'm watching other people. You ever feel that? You see, so I was, a couple of days ago, I was driving, and I have a 5-year-old daughter. Her name is Shiloh. She's upstairs. We'll probably hear her running in a moment. And I was driving in the car, and she has this giant stuffed animal narwhal that she calls Bubbles, and it is her absolute favorite thing in the world. And if you've ever been to our house, you know this because it takes about 5 minutes before she runs upstairs and comes dragging this thing down the stairs. It's 3 times her size. It's this massive thing. And we get in the car, and she's like, I want to bring Bubbles with me. And I'm like, you're not bringing Bubbles, okay? Bubbles takes like the whole back seat, okay? And she's like, but why don't we put it in the back? But if I put it in the back, then it blocks everything, right? I can't see behind the car. It's huge. And I've told her this. I've said, Shiloh, you cannot bring Bubbles in the car because when you do, it blocks my ability to view behind the vehicle, right? I can't see it. She's like, well, why does that matter, Daddy? That doesn't matter. Well, of course it matters. You have to be able to view behind you to be able to see who's coming, right? You have to be safe. And in life, there's a similar need to be able to look into the rear view of our lives, learn from our experiences, and to be able to, based on what has happened in the rear view mirror of our lives, be able to look at the future and be able to make wise choices, right? Well, there are really two types of experiences that we look at. When you look into the rear view mirror of your life, you see messes and you see miracles, right? It's a messy past that we have. And when you look back and you see the broken relationships, you see the moments of hurt, broken trust, the times when you had an expectation and then there was reality and it seemed like a big letdown. Okay, there's those things, right? There's the messes. But then there's the miracles. There's the times that you look back in your past and you see where God provided, where you thought that you were alone in something and then it turned out that God was there every step of the way. And it's important for us to look back on our lives and put both the messes and the miracles in perspective and be able to look forward to our lives with a sense of understanding of where God is at work. So here's where we're going to pick up. We're going to go to Psalm chapter 22. And so if you have a Bible, go there. We don't need to turn to it yet. We're going to go to Psalm chapter 22. So if you have a Bible, go there. If you don't have a Bible, scroll there or look it up or whatever. And we're gonna read this passage together. Okay. Let me give you a little bit of background before we put it all up there. We don't need to put it up there yet. So David, it's at least ascribed to him. And David, if you know anything about him, he's a major figure in the Old Testament of the Christian scriptures. And he was a king and a ruler of the Israelites, who were God's people, his chosen people. If you've ever heard the story of David and Goliath, the big giant, right? And this young boy who takes down this Philistine soldier. Okay, it's this David, right? This is the David that we're reading. Now, at this time, he is a king. He's a ruler over a country, right? And everything that we understand about his life is that he reigned over one of the greatest times of expansion, at times peace, and at the times when they were at war, they won battles that they should have never won, right? This is David. He's held up as a sort of a hero. Now, he was also a train wreck of a person, okay? He cheated on... he had some sin in his life, right? He had some brokenness in his life. And yet, he always seemed to come back and pursue God with all of his heart. He's known as a man after God's own heart. This is the David that we're reading, okay? Now, in this passage, we open up to a place of total desperation. And I might say that he was experiencing a giant loneliness in his life, okay? So that's where we pick up. And I want to start in verse 1, okay? So, he begins, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night I lift my voice, but I find no relief. Now I want to stop there. This may be exactly where you are right now. You feel like God is nowhere to be found. You have things that you are facing in your life, and this is exactly why you feel alone. The things that are in front of you, nobody has an adequate solution. Nobody around you is capable of stepping in. And if they are capable, you're so ashamed and so hurt in this situation that you would never reach out. You kind of wish that somebody would ask how you're really doing when they show up on a Sunday morning and say, how are you doing? and you have to put on your fake smile because you think there's no way they would want to know the truth, what's really going on. But if you had a moment where you knew that without any judgment, you could share with them what was really going on in your life, you would say, let me tell you how I feel. I feel like God's abandoned me. I feel like he's so far away. I feel like I'm praying to him and I'm calling out to him, but he does not answer. And I feel like right now I'm getting absolutely no relief. And you feel totally and utterly alone. So that's where we start in Psalm chapter 22. But then he continues. And here's what he says. He says, yet you are holy. You're enthroned on the praises of Israel. Our ancestors trusted in you, and you rescued them. You see what he's doing? He's looking in his rear view. Okay? Our ancestors trusted in you. You rescued them. They cried out to you, and they were saved. They trusted in you, and they were never disgraced. So he's looking in his rear view, right? So you're looking in the foreground, right? Or you're looking in front of you, and you see all of this stuff going on, and you feel completely and totally alone. But then for a moment, he looks in the rear view, and he sees where God has been faithful. There's a study that was done in the 1950s by Dr. Kurt Richter. And in this study, it was one of those things where he needed to do an experiment. And he did this experiment on rats. Okay, so it's a little bit gross, okay? But we got a picture. I'm going to throw it up there. Let me just explain what's going on. I know, it's gross, rats. But he could have done this experiment on humans, okay? So just saying. So he does this experiment in the 1950s. And here's how it works. It's a well-known study. He took rats and he put them in a bucket, right? And to see how long that they would last, okay? Not very humane, okay? But people love to save dolphins. I don't know many people that are advocating for rats, so I think he probably felt okay about it. So he puts these rats in, he drops them in the water, he sees how long they'll last. Well, the first group that he put in, they seemed to last for a while, and then he went and he got these wild rats from, out in the wild, and they were known for being really good swimmers. But when he dropped them in, you know how long it took them to give up? About 15 minutes. About 15 minutes. And I had to go and look this up, and I had to research and double, triple reference because I didn't believe it when I read this study the first time. And if you know about it, you know what I'm about to say. Then what he did was he took another group, okay, and he put them into the buckets, and at the point when they gave up and they dropped, he would take them out, give them a few minutes to recover their breath, and then he'd put them back in. Not 1, not 2, not 3 hours later, but 60 hours later, they were still swimming. After the first time, it took 15 minutes, right? And all they needed was to experience one rescue, one time being pulled out from the depths, and they had something to look back to. And there's something about that. Because see, this is for you and me in our own lives. Isn't this the truth when it comes to your relationship with Jesus? When you experience God's power and his might, when you experience him bringing you through something that you thought was impossible, and you came through the other side. Okay, most of us who are followers of Jesus, we're not followers of Jesus as much intellectually as we are on a heart level, because we've seen God come through. And we've experienced how hope can turn messes into miracles in our lives. And when hope turns messes into miracles, we look back in the rear view of our lives and we see life through a totally different lens. Which is why you can go up against the next great barrier, the next great challenge, knowing that you're not alone. And loneliness, it just has no effect on this. So now you look at your marriage. And when your marriage goes through something very, very difficult, and then you come out the other side and you're still in one piece, you find that your marriage is stronger, right? It's still scarred, right? You still got hurts and wounds, but you come out in a totally different place. In the relationships that you have with your friends, when you go through crisis together. I mean, I've asked people this so many times. When have you ever felt a greater sense of purpose in your life with other people? And almost every time, people will point back to a group of people that they experienced adversity with. There's something about going through that. You come out the other side and you go, wow, God brought me through. I don't have to give up. I can keep moving forward. And at this point, it's not even about your effort, right? This isn't about you trying hard and white-knuckling it all the way through. This is about you recognizing that I don't have to stop because I know that God is here with me on the other side of this crisis. And when I feel alone and desperate, I know that I can call out on my Creator and He will be there with me because He is for me. So, David continues in verse 16. He completely forgets what he was just saying. And he says, my enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They've pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones, and my enemies stare at me, and they gloat. David forgot his identity. He forgot who he was. In this moment, he stopped looking back through the rear view and looking for miracles. He was looking back in his rear view at just the messes, right? So now he's looking and he's completely forgotten that God is there with him, even in the midst of his crisis. This is who he is. You are David, the son of Jesse, the 13th born. Not being the firstborn, you were elevated to firstborn status in a culture where being firstborn was everything. You were made a king. You took down the greatest warrior that the Israelites had ever faced, that entire armies trembled in front of, and you walked up with bravery and courage, and you took down Goliath. That's you, the king. And you forgot who you are. It's nothing but my enemies surrounded me. And look, they pierced my hands and feet. And they stare at me and they gloat. And I'm helpless and I'm alone. You have forgotten who you are. And you've forgotten that when you look in the rear view, you need to look for miracles. And all you're doing is looking for messes. You've forgotten that God comes through for you. Isn't that us? Isn't that us? You see, when your present circumstances are viewed through the lens of past messes, it can only lead to loneliness. When that's all you look for, you will always feel alone. You will never sense God's presence because you're looking for the places where He wasn't instead of the places where He was. And if you look for the places that He was, you'd find out that even when you felt like He was distant, He was actually there every single time. So he continues, verse 24. Now he recovers his sense. For he is not ignored or belittled. This is what it means to look back in your rear view through the lens of the miracles. He's not ignored or belittled the suffering of the needy. He has not turned his back on them, but he's listened to their cries for help. I will praise you in the great assembly. I will fulfill my vows in the presence of those who worship you. You see, when your present circumstances are viewed through the lens of past messes and it leads to loneliness, when your present circumstances are viewed through the lens of past miracles, it can only lead to worship. And here's the thing about worship. What worship is, right, is when we forget everything around us and we focus in and we allow something outside of ourselves to fulfill our needs and wants. Which is why I would say that whether you believe the whole Jesus thing or not, you're a person of worship. Whether you believe that Jesus is who He says He was, you're a person of worship. There is something in your life that you allow to fill the void. There's something in your life that you look to fulfill your needs and wants and desires. But when we look at our Creator and we ascribe to Him that worth, when we look at Jesus and we let Him fill our needs and wants and desires, we experience something that takes us outside of ourselves, right? It gets us to not think about our present calamities and crises and gets us to look in the foreground. When we look through the rearview mirror and we see the miracles, we look forward looking for miracles. When we look through the rearview looking for messes, we look forward looking for messes. That's what we do. It's in our nature, which is why as humans, our brains are hardwired a certain way, and yet those pathways can be changed. We've talked about that. When you continue to dwell on the things of God, you train your brain for how it's meant to interact with the world around you. You see, worship is a loneliness crusher. There is no way that loneliness can stand under the weight of the Almighty. When you give your heart, when you give your everything about you to the King of Kings, there's no way that loneliness can win the day. So going back to your marriage and your finances and your workplace and your relationships with your siblings and your neighbors and everybody, when you say, this is, a couple of weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we did our grand opening, right? And what many of you may not know is that prior to that, a few weeks earlier, we lost one of our team members. You see a lot of these people with the yellow shirts and stuff. He had gotten his booster, and a month later, he passed away. And Greg Marciano, he's a close friend to many of us. And I think this is a guy that I've learned so much from. And one of the things and I've shared this with a lot of people, but one of the things that I've shared with people was this interaction that I had when he was at the hospital, and they had him quarantined. And they wouldn't let anybody come in to see him. And I called him, and I'm on the phone with him, and I say, Greg, I am so sorry that you're there alone, and that people aren't there with you. And you want to know what Greg said to me? Brian, I'm not alone. I've got Jesus right here in the room with me. He had total perspective. Right? This is a person who he understood what worship can do. When you let Jesus fulfill your needs, wants, and desires, he was perfectly fine. You see, that's what happens, right? Because he looked back on his life and he recognized his own brokenness. He was very open about it. He saw where his life had affected other people negatively. But he met Jesus. Jesus changed him. Jesus wrecked his world in the most incredible of ways. And because of the power of Jesus in his life, when he would look in the rear view, he saw miracles and not the messes. That's what he was looking for. And so that's how he looked at his present circumstances. In Matthew 27:46, you see these words. And this is Jesus on the cross. And it's the same opening words as we just read in Psalm 22. The Aramaic for that, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. He cried these words, he uttered these words from the cross as other people around him were in total desperation and feeling totally and completely helpless. Now, a lot of people believe that Jesus was there feeling like the Father had turned his back. In fact, I grew up in a tradition that believed that the Father and the Son had separated at that point in history, that was theologically how we explained that Jesus took on the sin, was that God had to turn away from him. Now, I really don't believe that. I don't believe that the reason why he said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, was so that he could express to everyone around him how he believed that the Father had turned his back. I believe that the reason that Jesus said these words was because he knew that the other people around him had been looking in the rear view of their lives, looking for messes, and they saw that present circumstance through the lens of the mess and not through the lens of miracles. And he wanted them to remember back to Psalm 22. And if you were a Jewish person at that time, you would have known. He was quoting that text and reminding you back so that you would look back at the circumstances of David. When David sat feeling hopeless and abandoned by the Father and then saw his circumstances changed and his view of his present circumstances changed. You cannot read Psalm chapter 22 without going from death to life. That's how it reads. And it's how we would refer to Old Testament passages. In the New Testament, we refer back to the opening lines of any Old Testament passage so that you would then read the rest. He's hyperlinking, right, back to that so that we would recognize that. Your present loneliness, and this is the point, your present loneliness doesn't get to determine your ultimate outcome. Jesus does. So when you are sitting in your hurt and your loneliness and your brokenness and you're feeling completely desperate and completely alone and you're feeling like there's no way that anyone could understand my circumstances right now, those circumstances are a moment where your spiritual enemy is going to want to try to place you in bondage and keep you away from an intimacy that is only meant for the Father. And only Jesus gets to determine the ultimate outcome of your circumstances. Only Jesus gets to determine where your happiness comes from. Only Jesus gets to determine whether or not you feel completely helpless and alone or not. Because when you give yourself to Him, you can't go there. Loneliness gets crushed under the shadow of the cross. So this is how he ends in Psalm 22, David. Starting in verse 30b. It's supposed to be B because it's the second half of verse 30. Future generations will hear about the wonders of the Lord, and His, God's, righteous acts will be told to those not yet born. They will hear about everything He has done. And you want to know these words right here? He has done. Ma shalom. Ma shalom. It's Hebrew. We got another slide there. There you go. It means it is at peace. Shalom means peace. It's also a word that means final or canceled. It is at peace. So when we come to the Father and we begin to look at our present circumstances through the lens of the miracles and not the messes, He brings it to peace. John 19:30, we know these are the last words that Jesus spoke. Jesus said, "It is finished." And then He bowed His head and He gave up His spirit. These are His final words on the cross. Do you want to know what that was in Aramaic? Ma shalom. It is at peace. It is finished. It is canceled. The Greek is telestai. It is canceled. Your loneliness, your hurt, your brokenness, your sin, your past mistakes, your past wounds, the places where you felt completely isolated, it's all brought to peace. Under the shadow of the cross, all loneliness is brought to peace. And you can rest in that. You can rest knowing that the giant of loneliness has been slain. And your heart can rest. Your soul can rest. Your mind can rest. You can sleep at night because you know that it's been brought to peace. Let me pray for us.